Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Katherine Kowalczyk, and welcome to the Responsibility Quotient podcast. Today is Thursday, March the 21st, and I cannot believe that we're almost into spring already. I'm grateful for that because I don't know if you're like me, but the long, dark days of winter are depressing, and I'm grateful that it's getting lighter out these days. So, in continuing on with my quest to empower people to reclaim personal responsibility, I have a great guest on tonight. But first, I think you're going to like what Jim has to say. If you're a freedom fighter like I am, and I'm sure you are, if you're watching this podcast, a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight will resonate with you. um, I stumbled upon an article on X last week about land acknowledgements and residential schools, and I'll bring that up in a second. But I think where I'd like to start off today is with a quote about responsibility, and seeing if we can set the tone of tonight's podcast with Jim. And this quote is by Steve Maraboli from Unapologetically You: Reflections on Life and Human Experience. And he says, the victim mindset dilutes the human potential. By not accepting personal responsibility for our circumstances, we greatly reduce our power to change them. And I bring that up because, and what struck me about that quote in particular was the word victim. And I think maybe Jim might have some things to say about this. And I'm going to introduce Jim in a second. But this is the article that I want to draw your attention to that I was happy to stumble upon, as I said. It's called A Teacher Who Won't Salute. And you can find that on the Frontier Center for Public Policy website. Jim McMurtry completed a master's degree at the University of Alberta under the supervision of Dr. Robert Carney, a leading authority on Indian residential schools who documented their positive role in the development of Indigenous communities. He obtained a PhD from the University of Toronto in the philosophy of education. As well, Jim has taught for 4 decades, most recently French immersion in Abbotsford, BC. And for a time, he was a college lecturer and the principal of Neuchâtel Junior College in Switzerland. His father, some of you may know, was Roy McMurtry, who was a Chief Justice, Attorney General in Ontario, Ambassador to Britain, and CEO. So welcome to the podcast, Jim.
Welcome to everybody there. It's an honor to be here with you, Katherine.
Well, thank you so much. Like I said, we've never met before, and I was on X the other day and read your article, and I said, yes, somebody's speaking out about land acknowledgements and the residential schools. And so I reached out to you, and you've been so gracious to come on to my podcast. I want to first start off by saying my condolences. I know that your dad has recently passed away this week, and I was happy to postpone everything, but you were very adamant that you wanted to come on and continue to share your story and your perspective. For those of you who may not know and may not have read your article, Jim, you're a teacher, you're a school teacher. You were teaching with in Abbotsford, BC, up until last year. And your article does detail some of this, but maybe can you explain for our viewers what led up to you writing this article, A Teacher Who Won't Salute?
I'm an old, it's really not very convincing to people, but I'm an older teacher. There's a lovely song, Bobby McGee, that Janis Joplin sings, and there's a line in it, a verse that says, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. And so I'm in an age and a stage in my life that I can do the right thing. It's pretty hard to do because if you're a younger teacher, because they do fire you. And I was fired officially a little over a year ago, but I haven't taught for 3 years. And I was walked out of my classroom and my career for saying that something was an established truth, that residential school children did not die at the hands of their teachers, that they did so from disease, mostly tuberculosis. But there are other things. So, you've mentioned land acknowledgements, and there's, of course, gender and race, indigenous indoctrination, censorship of literature, falsification of history, lowering standards, even equity marking, and forcing kids to wear equity backpacks. And but coming back to land acknowledgements, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in a lot of schools, the kids and the teachers not only have to listen to it every day, but they have to stand to it. And many schools now don't have a Canadian flag. They have an indigenous flag, which represents the Holocaust that took place, the genocide at residential schools. And then they have the trans flag, the pride flag, whatever you want to call it, which keeps on changing, which excludes Asians, whites, heterosexuals, and all sorts of others. So I think schools have been captured by woke cultists. I think it's an absolute offense to anyone of Christian heritage, because Christians are the bad guys who apparently did nothing good in the history of our country. I had 4 relatives who were missionaries, and to hear them described as murderers is not easy to take. So I made a decision, and people said at the beginning, it's the hill you're going to die on. That was almost 5 years ago. And I said, yeah, but it's also the hill that I'm going to do what's right on. And and I have, and I've got a big following, and I've been in all sorts of newspaper stories and written many articles myself. And I know that my employer, my union, my regulatory body, my government, who all are opposed to me because they're all colluding to indoctrinate children, they know they're dealing with somebody that they haven't dealt with before. Because I'm just standing in principle. And that's what my father did. During the late 1970s, there's so much violence in hockey games that my father one day said, arrest them. And that's not an easy thing to do when you think of how popular hockey is in Canada. But they arrested a lot of the hockey players in the Philadelphia Flyers hockey team. My dad was threatened by the KKK because he didn't want the head organization to come into Canada. We all experienced death threats in the family. He was a tough guy. And sorry?
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I hope I'm hoping that that I'm a chip off the old block, that you can't go into the teaching profession, any profession, unless you, in my view, wanting to do the right thing for not just the profession, but in this case for children and for posterity, for everything that comes after us. To lie to children about history is really egregious. It's like a dystopian Orwellian novel in which everything is erased. So people, the woke people who like to virtue signal and make it seem as though they're so much better than everybody else because they have these really neo-communist ideas. So that's where I am. I'm against it all. And you can, of course, tailor this conversation to what areas you want me to talk about. But you're not going to get other teachers on your show, Katherine, who are going to say what I've already said and I'm going to say, because they too will lose their job if they do.
Well, thank you so much for being on here. And I suspect you're right. For the last 4 years of my advocacy, for very good and compelling reasons, on some level, people have remained silent, and they have acquiesced, mostly because they had no other choices. And a lot of them did things that they normally would not have done. For instance, like take a medical experiment against their will in order to keep their jobs, for instance. And so I do thank you for being for brave and courageous and principled, because we need to, I think, lead by example as best as we can. And you're right, like taking this sort of level of responsibility, um, it has consequences. Freedom is not free, definitely. And however, but I firmly believe that we have an obligation to not only ourselves as individuals, but to our children and our grandchildren, to leave them a society better than how we found it. And certainly I can, I'm turning 49 this year, and I can say truly that this country doesn't resemble anything that I grew up believing to be true. And maybe let's talk, before we delve into your article a little bit more, and really the nuts and bolts about what is happening in the school system in British Columbia, because I'm sure that a lot of it is paralleled here in Alberta. I can, if you go on the Alberta Teachers Association website, you'll see nothing but rainbows and equity and all the rest of that kind of stuff, right? So I do want to talk about that, because I have a lot of concerns about where our politicians and our institutions are taking society generally. But your dad was instrumental in the negotiations of the charter. And I don't know if you've watched my past episodes or have heard me speak before, but since COVID, I've been kind of piecing together the 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 charter and not trying to understand it, not having practiced constitutional law. I'm a family law lawyer by trade, but certainly when COVID happened, it ignited me, and I became more familiar with our rights and freedoms as the charter has them presented. And your father, it sounds like, was instrumental in having the notwithstanding clause added to the charter. Can you speak at all to what you know about that?
Well, I'm not an authority on it, surprisingly, and I should be, because I have a different take from my father, and that was that there were 8 provinces in particular that were united, and the problem was to the remaining 2, and Quebec never joined in. But how were they going to get everybody to agree? So they came up with an idea that would work for everybody, and they called it the kitchen accord, or the kitchen cabinet. And it says in school textbooks, because I've seen my dad there, that they sat up late at night drinking coffee. And my dad didn't drink coffee. I'm sorry, he drank scotch. But anyhow, there's lots of things there. But what interests me about that is this, that my father was no different than his mother and father, and everybody that I knew up and grew up with in Toronto, that we always thought Canada was a pretty great country, and we would never have understood if what we're hearing, what's happening right now, was I think it would be in complete disbelief. How can we think that Canada shouldn't have common values? How can the charter be so weakened right now that it just seems like, first of all, every judge or arbitrator or adjudicator is a critical social justice fanatic, ideologue, and then the obvious laws, they're not looking at them. They're always looking for the exception. With equality, no, it's not equality. It's because, no, we have equity. We have Section 15 and affirmative action. But I think people right now, with our charter, with our constitution, with our country, are not seeing it for what it is. It's one of the most tolerant, welcoming countries in the world. We have an absolutely glorious past. We brought all these elements together that were quite disparate and at war in some ways. And I don't just mean Indigenous people and colonists. I mean the British and the French, as you know, fought for a good part of Canadian or early Canadian history. And there are many other groups, and there was wars between Protestants and Catholics, and it was just, but it worked in the East and the West, and all the things that people tried to do. People like MacDonald, who built a railway very heroically. And so here's my father. Was almost 92 when he passed, and saying to him, Dad, you're this guy who has always loved your country. What do you think about people who go out and chop off John A. MacDonald's head, or take his name from the law school, the Faculty of Law at Queen's University, or even take it off the pub in Kingston that was always known for generations as John A. MacDonald? Probably it's just complete erasure of obliteration of everything that I had in the way of touchstones, benchmarks of knowing who I am and where I was. These were good people. We did something amazing in Canada, and we still do this. And this idea that you take immigrant kids and you put them into school, and with land acknowledgements, for example, you say to them, the land isn't theirs. It's owned by this one group. And this one group, by the way, is mixed because there's not many people who are pure anything racially. But this one group is one day probably going to have everybody's land. And you are going to be like a feudal serf or tenant or vassal, and you're going to have to pay somebody else.
Yeah.
And these are people, in many cases, kids whose families came to Canada to get away from war or starvation, disease, or one conflict or another. And they don't want to be told that Canada is even worse from when they came to. So it's just absolutely mind-boggling for me, Katherine, from the perspective as a teacher and as a Canadian, that anyone would put up. We're Canadian hockey players, but someone wouldn't be first get a hockey stick and hit these people on the head. What do you mean we're a racist country? What do you mean we're settlers? Then other people aren't settlers. Well, what do you mean? Everybody that's in the land is settled. What do you mean the modern Western civilization is disgraceful? Relative to what? What is better than Canada?
Well, that's what's so amazing to me. Like, sorry to jump in here, but
Please.
I mean, but it is the language. It is the language that is being used that I don't believe is being scrutinized. Like, for instance, what does decolonization mean? Can you tell me what decolonization means and how is that being disseminated throughout schools?
Well, I think the word "de" means is to take away from, and to denude or destroy or whatever. Anyhow, so the word when I was in university in the early 80s, that they used the word deconstruction. That these postmodernists beginning in the 60s, and so they had this idea that we can improve society. So we need to look in a microscopic way about everything about our institutions, everything about our society, and make it better. And I was an early deconstructionist or decolonialist in a sense, because I didn't like the way Black people were treated, indigenous people were treated, women were treated, all those things during my lifetime. I was born in 1959, so my mom wasn't allowed to wear pants to school. She had to wear a dress or a skirt. And so I just think that we did a great job in the 70s and 80s and to create rights and freedoms. Again, this is the thing that's associated with my father. And then something happened. It just is part of the group in society that didn't read anything about communism or too young to know that communism didn't work out, folks. And they think, well, no, what we need to do is we need this complete equality. And of course, you can't have communism without violence. You can't take from one group, give to another, and think everybody is going to be happy with that. The kulaks were destroyed in Russia. And I think what's happening is people with my demographic are being destroyed in the school system. And it's not just me as an adult. It's kids. They look at kids in a classroom who are white, and they point their finger at them and they call them all sorts of names. A lot, not just colonial, they're much worse names, privileged and racist and all these things. And so often it's the areas where I've been teaching, that there's a lot of Punjabis, and many of the schools have been mostly Punjabi, and many of the parents are very well off. So all the brown kids are sitting there in the classroom and they're listening to the few white kids about how privileged they are. And they live and the brown kids live in big houses and have wonderful cars and wonderful opportunities, and so many got everything going for them. These tall, handsome, smart, ambitious kids. And the white kids in some schools, like in Abbotsford, are part of. There's a group in a society. There's always going to be a substrata where there are people who are less successful, and you're starting to see that in where I live in Surrey and where I worked in Abbotsford. Of a lot of white people who are the ones that are living in the basement apartments of the immigrant who owns the house, and many white. You go to trailer parks, they're almost all white. That's how trailer park boys work. They didn't show people of all sorts of religions and races, because it tends to be sadly, and there's an underclass of white people in North America and maybe all through the Western world. To call those kids privileged and to say they're fragile and to associate them with all these negative things, I started saying to colleagues when this began happening, I just said, how dare you? How do you dare to any kid? These are birth characteristics.
Well, the thing that strikes me in all of this as well, I mean, I'm white, I'm Christian, I have a son, I have a daughter, who have indigenous ancestry through their father. Um, but I have a real fear for my son in particular. I mean, my daughter as well. Not only because of the DEI agenda and this trans agenda that's sweeping the globe, but also because of what you're describing and this singling out and this racism that's occurring. I mean, when I grew up, I never saw. I mean, like anything, nothing is absolutely perfect. Of course, there's always going to be bad actors and bad players in our society. But by and large, I would never have described um, our 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 society as racist from my perspective. I mean, I'm a woman in law, for many years male dominated, certainly misogynistic on many fronts, and certainly I experienced some of those things in my career that I could have attributed to that, and I could have also continued with this victim mentality that I, wasn't going to be able to overcome that. I never really felt any barriers really, but I digress. But I'm really concerned because it's not like racism in Canada, I don't think was by and large a thing. Like that seemed to be something that really got kickstarted or adopted from the United States, right? And their history and slavery and whatnot. And I'm not saying that bad things did not happen with our indigenous communities in the past, but how can you rationalize us or our children having to take responsibility for something that, first of all, we didn't do? We have no control over really what happened at all in the past, yet we are made to feel this guilt and this shame, and and have these labels foisted upon us, and including having to recite the land acknowledgement every day in school or at school assemblies. How did we get there? And from your perspective of a teacher, how is it that when did you start seeing this start creeping into the education system?
Well, I really saw it from the beginning of my career, and it was innocent enough, and relating to what you're saying, that when I graduated with a doctorate, I was told that I had no chance really of getting a university position because they were the most of the professors at the time were male, and so they wanted to hire a lot of women. And then a few decades later, they're saying, "Oh no, we it's not women so much because there are a lot more women than before, but everybody's white, so let's just hire people who aren't white or who aren't Christian." And we don't have. Recently, I was told there was an opening at the Simon Fraser University near where I live, and they said that a friend of mine who works there said, "Jim, you could get this job." And I said, no, there's not interest in me. I'm all those things that they'll never hire, white, straight, able-bodied male who thinks independently. And they said, no, it's the job is reserved for somebody who is transgendered. So if you could just self-identify as a transgendered person, I know they don't have anybody else, and I know they'd hire you, and I'd put in a good word for you. And I said, well, wow, do they do that with pilots? Do they go, oh, well, we have a problem in Canada because we have a lot of white pilots, and they're landing planes safely. But forget the safety thing. Let's just think that there's not enough diversity, whatever. But shouldn't be the most important thing be the who can land the plane safely? I just don't understand this. The kids, when they talk about rights and freedoms and responsibility and values, and that's what I mentioned earlier, that I think we inherit them much more easily at an earlier time in our country than we do today, because people are taught to be victims or victimizers and so on. But what extraordinary for me is everyone's talking about how performance in school is because of racism, and you go, what do you mean? By far, one group is dominating. One group is dominating. In fact, at UBC, the University of British Columbia, they have gone away from marks to a large extent. It used to be based on marks. Now it's on resumes and one thing after another. Really what they're doing is all racial quotas. And I know that's for law school as well, because my 3 kids went through law school. And when they applied to the University of Victoria, they weren't asked about anything, what their philosophy was about law, what they had accomplished, this, that, and everything else, what their volunteer record was. They just had to fill out this long thing about telling exactly what the racial past was. And so the whole thing's just become a farce. It's no longer. But coming back to schools, if schools were racist, why are Asian kids at the top of the class? There's many high schools where there's a variety of different groups, and they read out the honor roll. I mean, the top honor roll, not the honor roll of today, which is 99% of the kids, but the ones that win prizes and so forth. And you have disproportionate number of Asian kids dominating, and as we had in the past with Jewish kids. And anyhow, so why is that? Is it racism? Because I think Jews had a hard time in Canada, even today. I think Asian people had a hard time building the railways and being paid half what everyone else was paid. And many of the coolies called terrible names and died in the process. Look at them. They're succeeding to the greatest extent. So what does that tell you? Do you help? So you said that through your husband, your child with indigenous background. And I think that can be a problem, because in the school system, the school I was at, I'll use the example. It's just a school in Abbotsford called W.J. Mowat. And they had a separate department for anyone with a trace of indigenous blood. And when I say indigenous, because it could be blonde haired, blue-eyed, whatever, but as long as there's a great-great-grandmother, whatever. So that kid is indigenous. But what they do is they take these kids out of the regular program, and they do all sorts of things for the kids. There's all sorts of money from special lunches and graduate and ceremonies and trips and all sorts of things. They do all these things for the kids. And the kids are no more successful than they were 10 years ago or 50 years ago. Because they're in fact, in many cases it's worse, because they're not trying to, they're just lowering the bar for these kids. It's like having a 100-meter race and starting everybody at different spots and thinking you're helping them. No, you'll never be as good as the kid that had to work hard. The kid that really had to take responsibility for his or her own actions. And
then we end up, and I think what we end up, we don't build resiliency within our children and within people generally, in order to be able to adapt to the demands of everyday life. And I certainly see that not only with the children, but in my profession as well, in family law, where I deal with divorce and people who are struggling with their interpersonal relationships on a daily basis. And I can see firsthand the damage and the destruction that is occurring right now with our families and our social structures. And we don't have the support that we need, or the tolerance in our society to want to actually fix the real problem, which is with the root of the problem, which is this moral decay that's happening in our society. So can you explain to me then, so what happened a few years ago with because I understand that land acknowledgements kind of started coming out more regularly in 2015 after Trudeau got was elected, and also as a result of the Truth and Reconciliation report that came out. And that report seemed to captivate everybody, and was the marching orders for the virtue signaling that was to come by everybody in our society. And I know from my profession as a lawyer, the law societies got on board with that, and we talked about this a little bit last week when I contacted you, that in our in our law society in Alberta is requiring lawyers to do this cultural competency training. The first course as a condition of practicing law. And so if I don't take it, and if I don't answer their questions correctly, then I don't get to, and I don't pass the course, then I don't get to practice law in Alberta. And that's where we're at. And the first course was called The Path, and it was about indigenous culture. And and so I'm also part of a group that's fighting against that, and has been fighting against the law society's unilateral, and I think improper creation of a rule that allowed them to have the path as as cultural training for the lawyers. But and in fact, one of my colleagues is suing bringing judicial review against the Law Society over this creation of this rule that empowered the Law Society to do this. But what I'm interested in, though, is like you're teaching in Abbotsford, and then all this, and slowly, not slowly and not so slowly over time, religion is removed, the flag is removed, the Canadian flag is removed from the classrooms. And then what you're seeing then is then this land acknowledgement. And I can tell you, every time I go to my kids' school's assembly or anything else that really has anything to do with the government, primarily it is all prefaced with this land acknowledgement. And I, for one, don't stand for it at all. I don't participate in it, and I don't like it. I don't like I don't like it at all. And I think that most people, or some people, perhaps feel the same way I do, and perhaps the same way you do. A lot of them are going along to get along, and but as a result of that, it's kind of taken on a life of its own, like its own religion.
Yes, the quote, if we were working, allow me this one quote, and you've heard it before, Burke: all it takes for the triumph of evil is for good men and women to do nothing. And every single teacher, every single administrator, every single trustee, every single senior manager, every single government official in Canada is not publicly criticizing this. There are a few brave people here and there who might not stand, or who might mutter under their breath, we shouldn't be doing this, and doing it every day. It's compelled speech. And it's historically, just incredibly abusive, because it's not at all what history was. I'm going to come to that in a second. But two quick things. First of all, if I say to you, when you're talking about responsibility, and I just love everything you said, Katherine, because you're just very wise and profound person. If I could just say, as a teacher, I had this one kid. You were asking when these things were coming in and so forth. Well, all I can say is it's part of a big program, and mania, sort of like, I don't know, there was a time in school when every kids were walking around with pet rocks, if you can believe it. They threw out all the spellers. They knocked down classroom walls because they didn't want to divide classes from others. And of course, I worked for a week and didn't realize you couldn't hear yourself thinking. Anyhow, so there's always manias. There's always these fads that come in and out. That's what schools do. But I had this one kid about 5 years ago, and he was just the worst kid you can imagine. He would lie on his desk and wouldn't do any work, lie on the desk in front of the other kids, wouldn't listen, play music, disturb other people, keyed teachers' cars, including my own, just did absolutely everything. And all teachers have all passed him. And I said, okay, I'm going to deal with this kid. And I got no support. And then came to academic, and the kid became quite antagonistic toward me because he had never met that before, although he knew I was a nice person. And I would spend time trying to convince him that this wasn't the way to be successful in a classroom or society. Tolstoy said, what good is a house if you don't know how to live in it? So in the end, the boy didn't do any work, didn't hand anything in, didn't even come for the last 3 weeks of the school year. Just completely, it was just sort of in my face. He was going to pass anyway. So I failed him. And I had to explain that. I still didn't get support. And I left the school, and that's when I decided it was enough of that school. So I left the school and I went to Abbotsford. This is a serious school. And I phoned friends at the school and I said, that boy that was with me last year in grade 9 that I failed, could you find out if he was moved on to grade 10 social studies? And a couple of colleagues both inquired into it and they said, oh yeah. Said they don't fail anybody.
Yeah, that's what I heard.
So it doesn't matter. So you almost wonder, well, what if he was killing people? Like you almost wonder if, or not that serious, but something enough that he didn't have to be put in jail for, that they would still think, well, we have to reward this kid. So it's a bit of a sad world. So coming back to the compelled speech and the law thing and the land acknowledgements, it's not really my case. My case is about something different, and that I have, I feel like I'm somewhat of an authority, certainly very informed on Canadian history for all sorts of reasons. And so when people are lying to kids, that bothers me. No, just before I get there with the land acknowledgement, they present Canadian history very falsely. They said that in the past, we have been, committing a genocide against Indigenous peoples. And we are currently continuing with that genocide against against Indigenous people. The only example they ever used in schools is residential schools. So you go, boy, they must have been really bad for everybody to be talking about genocide. As you know, every member of parliament in the House of Commons, October 27, 2022, voted to support a motion saying that residential schools were genocidal. So you've got everyone. So with my father, I said to him, how do you feel about that, Dad? You're a politician, we're Chief Justice, you connected, you knew a lot of these people. They think very highly of themselves. And they voted to call residential schools a genocide. What do they know about genocide? And my father's reaction to me was, it starts with the word F, ing ridiculous. That wasn't the case. And then I'm somebody who went, and you mentioned at the outset that during my time in the University of Alberta, which is a wonderful experience, Mark Carney's father, the banker Mark Carney's father, was my thesis supervisor. And I wrote my thesis on residential Indian education policy, as we called it at the time. But it was a lot on the way they've been educated and stuff. And nothing's really changed because Indigenous kids are still taught in Western schools. Nothing has changed. It's just we pretend that it was so horrible back then, but today, oh no, it's okay today. But it's the same thing. There are a lot of Indigenous kids in residential schools because some still live in very remote reserves in the far north or whatever, and they're flowing in to live and be billeted in Winnipeg or somewhere, a city. And like kids from Korea, I've taught a lot of kids whose parents are in another part of the world, and they try and manage on their own, and it's rough and it's not nice and it's not perfect, but sometimes you have to do that. So the land acknowledgements, to me, it's not just compelled speech. And if anyone personally came up to me in the street or into my home or wherever, my classroom, and said, Jim, I want you to say this. I want you to do this land acknowledgement. I want you to say this about Canadian heritage. I want you to say this about trans people, or that there are no longer such thing as boys and girls, or all the stuff they're doing with kids, and all white people are fragile and privileged. And so I would say, over my dead body. And I think a lot of Canadians would, because no one is going to force me ever to say something that's, first of all, false, and secondly, compelled. That's not how I teach or parent. My parents never did that with me. They try and explain things. And then sometimes they'd set it down and say, okay, this, whether you like it or not, we're going to do it this way because we got to make a decision as a family where we're going to go on Saturday. Like, I get that. But the idea that my parents would say to me, you have to believe Jim in this religion, or Jim in this philosophy, or Jim in that this is your favorite uncle and you can't think for yourself about that. It's just absolutely hideous. So my case was similar to that. That the idea of people deforming history. And so I wasn't willing I knew I was going to be in big trouble. But you know what, something, Katherine, before I tell you my story, every single lawyer I know, and I know tons of lawyers, none of them has publicly protested the sensitivity training that they have to go through all across Canada, not just in Alberta. No one. They all go along to get along, as you said. No one, not a single person. That's the teaching profession. Go with the flow, and you might be promoted, or you might get.
Well, but I think, well, exactly, and well, if you don't, so I'm just going to adjust the camera here. But if you don't go along with it, obviously, I mean, there's consequences, of course. But some people, like, I'm not really sure where the critical thinking skills have gone in our society either. Like, it's like people have like lost their ability to constructively look at things and think, like, or just recall from whatever they did know from history, that perhaps what's happening right now doesn't quite make sense. Like, so it's quite amazing to me how society's been captured by all of this. I mean, there were but go
Can
ahead.
I just say on that note, because I think it's really important to me, is I don't believe it has anything to do with people's ability to think critically. I think we moved into an authoritarian period in our history, and that people are accepting it because there's personal consequences for not accepting it. And so you showed at the beginning an article by me, that a teacher who won't salute.
Yeah.
But as soon as I did that, Katherine,
Yeah.
I have no livelihood
Yes.
anymore.
Yeah.
Like this is,
Exactly.
so to me, it's not that people can't. You know how many lawyers? My world is full of lawyers, because not just my kids and my in-laws, but my brother and my sister, my father, my uncle, my grandpa. Just a ton of lawyers in the
I'm
family.
sorry, you're surrounded by lawyers.
But
That must be
anyway,
horrible.
and then they're friends and all that kind of stuff. So I have conversations with them, I ask them these questions. What the heck is going on? Why is it that you complain and you say, oh, you figured out a way to go to do the course and answer the questions without actually listening to doing or actually doing the questions, or you just stop every once in a while and do a question, but you put headphones on or whatever. So most people I know don't even participate. They don't participate in these sensitivity trainings within law firms. And I've never had someone say to me, oh no, I listened and for the whole 4.5 hours, whatever, and I did everything. And it's just absolutely incredible. But in addition to that, when you say about critical thinking, you're not allowed to. You're not allowed to go, okay, you put that in my face for 4.5 hours. I'd like to respond. And that's another thing that's very frustrating for young lawyers in particular. And I'm sure old lawyers, I'm sure any lawyer. Why is it that people can say to you something, which is as ridiculous to me as 2 + 2 is 5, and you just have to sit there and you can't say anything? I think that's the most awful thing. I just, I don't
Well,
know.
and well, it is awful, and this is, it's amazing to me how, I mean, how most of everybody has just accepted it as the way it is, and not only that, but don't want to ruffle feathers, or don't want to, they can even people in the so-called freedom community, I find quite fascinating as well, because it's this group, this it's like a infection. Like, as long as everybody else is doing it, I feel okay doing it in some way, shape, or form. So I think there's just a psychology around this that we're not fully appreciating. And I think that once we do get out of this, because once this this whatever communism, fascism, um, ends at some point, because it invariably will fail if history teaches us anything. It will fail, and when we rebuild, we'll be studying this era in our lives for forever, I think, and trying to figure out what the heck happened here. But like, I'm just so concerned by I'm just so concerned by the lack of involvement, and I see that every day. And I know that there are a few people that are trying to raise awareness around this, me being one of them. Our politicians are completely tone deaf. They're actually all in on this delusion that's happening right now on every level. There's not one sitting politician that is actually fighting out back against any of this stuff. And so all of a sudden, you have this Truth and Reconciliation report comes out, and then you have this new way of doing everything, and you're supposed to just accept it the way it is, and then you're a racist and you need to be canceled if you don't go along with this narrative. And so when you spoke out against this at your school, what was the result?
Well, I never, that's an interesting comment. By the way, once again, I love listening to you because you're obviously highly enlightened and articulate. I never spoke on it because I didn't want to lose my job. My wife has a very hard form of cancer to survive. I couldn't afford to lose my job. Like, how are we going to make it?
But you did, eventually you did, right?
No, I didn't. I actually didn't. I spoke out after I lost my job, or I
Oh,
knew I
okay.
was about to
Okay.
lose my job, but I did
Yeah.
everything that everybody else did. I was just
Right.
as scared as anybody else I have
Okay.
grandchildren. Why? I didn't want to not be able to pay my mortgage. I didn't want to lose my house. I didn't want not to be able to provide for my wife. And like, it's just, no, I was none of those things. So what happened is I felt this way. I expressed people quietly. I wrote to administration. I wrote to my trustees, my senior managers about land acknowledgements for the gender, the race, the indigenous, the censorship of literature, the falsification. I wrote about all these things. But in the politest way and quiet. So they knew who I was. I wasn't a conformist. And I was a nail that stuck up, and that's what they want to hit down on. But all I said was, one day, when the whole Canada, you use the word delusion, all Canada, all media, essentially all media, all professors, anybody who you kind of think, well, these government, you would think these people, there'd be someone with them, there'd be someone there who would know enough to want to know what the truth is. They all said that 215 child remains were found at a residential school. And they've
In
been
which, by the
sinking.
way, nothing's been found, right? We know that as of today, nothing's been found.
Yeah, and if I could say just on that, Katherine, but just where I was. So all I said was I didn't believe it because I had understanding. And again, Robert Carney, who knew the most about residential schools, in Canada, and I was lucky enough to have him as I said, my supervisor. He talked about all the good things they did. And so I never heard, well, we know the bad things. We know, and we're still doing the bad things. We're still putting Indigenous kids in English classrooms and teaching them Western values, such as how to read and write and do math and science. Like, yeah, like we're still, none of those things. The acculturation argument, the cultural genocide argument, to me is the most absurd of all, because that hasn't changed. And it will never change. Every immigrant kid that comes to Canada, including the first McMurtry that came to Canada, was Celtic, spoke a different language, had different customs, ate different foods. Everything was different. And when that's all gone. Nobody in my family knows how to speak Irish Gaelic or can do a dance. So my point is, everybody experiences cultural assimilation. So what really was wrong with the residential schools, in a serious way, in an intelligent way? What was wrong with the residential schools? So what they're saying is that the kids were abused, sexually and physically and all that kind of stuff. And I think, well, I bet there are cases of that, because my grandmother was raised by nuns and she was regularly hit. My wife's grandmother wasn't given an education by the nuns that raised her. She was an orphan, and they didn't think she was intelligent enough to waste an education on her. So she worked through her whole childhood in a laundromat. So I know, you go back in time, things are rough, but that was true for all schools. So what is different about residential schools that everyone's going genocide and all that sort of stuff? There had to be something really bad about it. So looking at the microcosm right now of Kamloops, you're saying 215 kids were dead. They're all, some as young as 3, which made no sense. That was in the newspaper, because how do you know unless you've dug how old the kid is or how small? And they're doing it, of course, because the graves are really shallow, which makes no sense either, because they don't have graves that are shallow, because animals will dig them up. So none of it made any sense to me whatsoever. But 215, so I researched it. And there were only 51 deaths during the whole history of the school, which is almost a century. Only 51 deaths, and they're all accounted for. And almost all the kids were buried in the home reserve. And in most cases, it was tuberculosis, which was the scourge for many. But there's Spanish flu, and we know the time, cholera and all sorts of things. So so all I did in my class, because I I didn't want to lose my job, and I wanted to be able to support my wife. So I didn't say anything. I went along with everything I was supposed to say. I was told to talk about, all the teachers at school that day were supposed to say, talk about, what's in the news. And I said, well, this is in the news and so forth, and talking about it. And, but it's my understanding that children who died, tragic, as tragic as it was, did so mostly from disease, some fires and accidents, but mostly from disease. That's all I said. And I had 2 male vice principals come up to my classroom, and they told me to collect my stuff. They didn't tell me what I did wrong. And they walked me out, and I refused to leave the school. And I said, it'd be easier for you if you took me to the principal so someone could tell me. So they decided that was the easier thing for them to do. And the principal said the most inane thing, that, it's because they didn't know you. I was a substitute teacher that day. So the kids didn't know me. So nothing I said was wrong. But as a substitute teacher, some kid reacted negatively. And that was enough to destroy my career and to humiliate me in that way and walk me out of the school. And I haven't talked since. So when I said earlier about, to me, it's not a time where people think less critically. It's not a time when people are less intelligent. It's not a time of any of those things. I think as a society, in particular with young people, I think in some ways they have to learn a little bit faster than they did. They have more opportunities to learn. Parenting has gotten better. Schools have gotten better in some ways. Kids have books in their homes and cell phones. They can research. Anyhow, I think the problem is authoritarianism, which is again a dimension of communism that people have to be forced to do things and to say things. So there's one thing, and I'm going to let you to speak for a little while because I'm talking too much. But the last thing that I'd like to say, and this may not be the right time, or maybe not at all, but I'd like to simply say that why are Canadians not actually researching residential schools? Why is everybody assuming there was only one priest that was ever charged with a sexual crime against a child in 150 schools over 150 years? So that doesn't suggest that this is, this epidemic. I went to the Toniest private school in the last 2 years of high school, Upper Canada College in Toronto, and there was a teacher predator there, which they didn't know about for about 10 years later until the guy was arrested. My point is that there are bad things that happen in schools, particularly residential schools. But why was there only one priest? And then there were only 2 nuns in the history of the schools that were ever arrested. And they're both indigenous. Both nuns were indigenous. So why do they think, why do people are saying it's like the Holocaust? It's like Auschwitz. Why? Where's the evidence?
Well, exactly. But, and I think by and large, many Canadians are so disengaged from their life, from the politics of things, right? They're just so busy managing their debt lifestyle that they don't have time to pay attention to these bigger issues. And that's at least from my experience, right? That this is what I'm seeing. It's all anecdotal, of course. Haven't done any official studies on it, but it's just it's just this general apathy. And I think it's because we've been taught subliminally and also overtly just to trust the authority, right? Like we're complying, we're to be nice, we're not to make any waves, and then we've slowly over time handed our government all of our decision-making capability, and gave them the authority rather than, and I mean, this is what happens, I believe, when you move away from God. I mean, as a Christian, I mean, I went through my periods of time, like I went to a Catholic school, and all of my 20s, I was totally not into religion and would have identified more as an atheist. And then, I went through a period where I was an alcoholic, and then when I got sober, found a higher power again, and now I'm back into finding my Christian faith and believing and seeing, because it really, what brought it to the forefront to me was COVID, and it was the recognition that when I looked around in our society and I read the Bible for the first time, and I thought, wow, we as a society are doing everything opposite of what the Bible is telling us to do. Everything that Jesus taught us to do, we're doing the absolute opposite of. And so I thought, you know, I just really believe that it's a moral decay. It's a we don't have these values anymore, and I think it is I mean, communism is based in Marxist theory, and you know, if you drill down even further, there's links to it's satanic, right? Really, at the end of the day, right? And so I believe what's happening right now is a spiritual war. It's manifesting itself through these bad actors in our society, and I don't even know if these progressives realize that they are Marxists in their heart, or if they actually do think that they're doing the right thing by forcing people to buy into this nonsense. But it's working, and it's devastating, and it's destroying our country. I mean, like, I don't know if you know about Bill C-63. Um, I mean, you don't get more authoritarian than that. I mean, it's you by trying to define by not defining hate speech and criminalizing it like they're doing, it is just it's actually quite terrifying for to see that this is happening in our society right now, and it's just everywhere. It's not just with indigenous, and I mean, and I don't think that we're giving anybody any. I mean, if we really truly wanted to help people, I think we would empower them and not continue to victimize them and perpetuate this victimhood mentality that we seem to beset upon all of our youth, and then they of course become adults who are useless.
Yeah, and used to taking handouts. The indigenous children in a classroom who are being told all the time, and now in this case that you know, people like me, my ancestors murdered your children at school. There's going to be tremendous civil, in my view, strife in the years ahead, because there'll be so much resentment built up. But just the one last thing about the residential schools, just the one thing that I want to say here is just give history as it was. That's all I'm asking for. I have, like everybody else, I have in the teaching profession, I couldn't care less what someone's religion is, or ethnic background, or whatever, or gender, or orientation. I just care about developing that child, to make the child think better, maybe the society, as you said earlier, to make society better. That's why we're both here today. You're
Yeah,
not paying to be in your show, and I'm not
yeah.
paying
I
you.
don't. I'm not making any money.
Yeah, and I'm not paying you. Like, my point is, we're doing this because we're committed to our country. So I just say the last thing on indigenous schools. Not only is it a terrible thing for these kids to develop so much hatred toward their society, and it's going to, of course, teach them that they don't have to work hard like everybody else. They just, play the victim card. But if I could just invite the people who are watching this to actually research. There's lots of places where one can research residential schools. There's from fantastic websites, if you can remember the name, Nina Green, or the Indian Residential School Research Group. That's an IRS-RG. There's all sorts of people you can go to that will tell you these are residential schools. In many cases, the parents applied. Only a third of First Nations and only a sixth of all Indigenous kids ever went to residential school. The average length of time was only 4.5 years. And so most kids never had that experience at all of even being in a residential school. And where they were, of course, were because there was no possibility of having a day school if it's a small nomadic band in the Northwest Territories or something. So when people consider that, then they start going, oh, well, yeah, because the alternative, you said earlier, the alternative, this idea of, the enemy of the good is perfect. Well, that's the same with residential schools. Well, yeah, they weren't perfect, and I'm glad we've improved upon education for Indigenous children. But that doesn't mean we should not have had them, because their parents wanted their children to learn English or French and to know how to make it in the modern world to earn the skills and so forth necessary to remove oneself from poverty and to be able to provide for one's own children. Like, that's why people work hard in school. There's you think there's going to be a reward in the end, a better life. So when you put that in that context, but it wasn't that with me. It was even worse. It was the idea that the teachers are going around murdering 215 in one school, and then as many as 25,000 or more in all the other schools combined, according to the chairman of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's just complete historical, anyhow, untruth. I could think of harsher words. Now, the one thing that you've mentioned a couple of times, and I know is a particular focus of you, and that's COVID. I want you to know that this thing is the same. During COVID in schools, you said kids are told to trust authority, but also to fear authority, because the moment a child says, well, why do we not have water fountains anymore? Because they closed off the water fountains. Many schools, they remove water fountains. I'm not sure how on a hot spring day or whatever, how and kids go to school in the summer as well, for summer school, how taking away water from kids is in their interest. They close playgrounds, whole playgrounds. Even if you were had one little kid and no one else was there, you couldn't go on this massive playground. It was just so incredibly authoritarian. So to me, the emphasis is not so much on trust, and that's certainly part of it, because these kids are in a nice way taught to, big brother, whatever, and the government knows best to do with COVID, and you don't have any choice, but it's a good thing because we're all together taking the same, drinking the same, Georgetown Kool-Aid, and everyone's going, well, if everyone else is doing it, it must be a good thing. But I think behind it all is fear. And that's the authoritarianism. And you use those words. You use the word fascism, and so we're speaking the same language. In compelled speech of land acknowledgement, the idea that during COVID, kids and teachers could not question any of the edicts that came down. Like a land acknowledgement is one example. But during COVID, nobody could dare. And the teachers that didn't, get their shots, they were removed from the classroom. And the kids that, that weren't going to do it, they were told they couldn't come to the classroom. Like, it was just an incredible thing of.
Well, and now, and in addition to that, now we're, on this trans agenda thing, transgender issue where, we're all perpetuating this lie that men can become women and women can become men. We know that it cannot happen. It is science, it is biology, it is what's true. Yeah, we're perpetuating this delusion as well. The adults in the room, the psychologists in the room, the doctors in the room, the lawyers in the room, the politicians in the room, all and the parents are going along with this, right? And it's the same thing. I mean, obviously, you can tell where my head is around that issue. I mean, I have deep concern for these children. I think that are being manipulated and abused and mutilated and subjected to this abuse by society, that are being told that they can do something that they absolutely cannot, and they're not actually given the resources to help them so that they can fully fulfill, find the love for themselves, with who they are as an individual, right? And I have such compassion and I'm fearful for these people, because for these children especially, because they're in these vulnerable positions, of course. Yet, I look at how our politicians aren't protecting them, their parents aren't protecting them, our judicial system isn't protecting them, and we're letting this craziness take over our society. But it's like it's with the lies with the residential schools, the untruths or whatever. I don't know how you want to call it, the lies. I mean, that's what it is. Like, they're not being truthful. And lying by omission is still lying, right? Like, you have to be able to present all the information and have a balanced approach to all of these things. And so there's this truth and reconciliation, then COVID, and now we have this trans agenda that is, like I said earlier, sweeping the globe. And so where do you see, like, how are we going to, and I always ask my guests this, like, how are we going to stop this? Like, what do we do? And I mean, so now you no longer have a job in the Abbotsford school system, right? You've gone through that process, and you had, the teachers union wasn't in, didn't do anything for you. I know the teachers, Alberta Teachers Association here is pretty useless. They have the woke mentality, but all of our institutions seem to have been captured by us. Even our so-called conservative Danielle Smith is on the bandwagon for all of this nonsense, right from Truth and Reconciliation to um, continuing continuing the jabs to allowing SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, to continue to be taught in our schools. So where do we go from here?
That's an excellent question. There's one other thing that's happened in the last 4 years, and that was the trucker convoy.
Yes.
All the people who were worried about losing their jobs and having to go back and forth across the border, all of a sudden became perceived as revolutionaries. They're going to topple the government, and they're misogynist and racist, and it's just the lies. There's just so many lies. So my situation, that I felt that everybody was against me. I had my union, my regulatory body, my government in all sorts of ways, and of course my employer. So what can I do? But I think I worked hard enough to I know I worked hard enough to convince some of the people of the union to stand with me. So my union's still with me. So I'm still fighting in through the grievance process. So I'm grateful to my union. Although many of my union think very differently from me, and believe in all this woke stuff and in the trans things and so. But it's been a hard fight, and I'm not done. And the reason they're going to have a hard time with me is because I'm never going to admit error, and they don't know what to do with people, because you can't take away my license. You can't fire someone without giving cause. So they haven't put down in writing what the cause is. What the employer did at first, put down as the cause, is just completely nonsensical. The idea that that there was a finding, they said in the cause, in my termination letter, they said there was a finding of 215 child remains. Well, of course there wasn't. And no one's going to dig, and the police aren't interested in investigating, and the archaeology report is hidden. You can't fly over drones over, because the federal government has prevented it. It's a no flyover zone. They've done everything humanly possible to make sure nobody ever goes into the ground to dispel what is an obvious lie. So to end all this stuff and more, and the ones, in addition to all this, is that the Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd, who's gone from being the criminal that he was to some sort of visionary Christ-like figure. And most upsetting for me, oddly enough, as an English history guy, I just think the best way to learn about English and history is to read good books, like To Kill a Mockingbird. And To Kill a Mockingbird is now banned from most school districts, and you could worry about losing your job if you were to read from a book like that, or even show the film To Kill a Mockingbird. So we've got lots of problems. So how to change it? I think you're doing it. I think you're amazing, Katherine. I think you're not just bringing on a freedom fighter, someone who believes like rights and freedoms, like my father, who did it within an established, respectable way, because he got to these positions. And but you're bringing in someone who's authentic. That I'm not trying to in any way win anything from this, and I'm not trying to get money. They've offered me money. The union keeps telling me, oh, if I just apologize or do this, or say, oh, I'll take this course, or oh, I should have thought better about this. Or I'll do trigger warnings next time and say to the kids, oh, if anything's emotionally distressing, you talked earlier about resilience. Oh, well, no. Essentially what you need to do right now in a school to be successful as a social studies teacher, English teacher, you need to say, kids, every time I open my mouth, something could come out that's offensive or upsetting to somebody. Please don't take my job away on it. If you say, oh, I'm going to have a hamburger for lunch, the Hindu kid's going to say, oh, you shouldn't eat cows. And the vegetarian kids say, you shouldn't eat meat. Anyhow, my point is, you can't do anything if we allow these people to rule. And that's what we've done. And with the trans thing, it's sad, because I'm very supportive of trans people. I'm supportive of anybody who's different than I am. because how do I really know what it's like? I just assume other people have struggles. If an Indigenous person came to me and said I had a hard time in residential school, I would say, well, I'm sorry to hear that, and tell me. I want to learn from that. Like, I never doubt anything, but at the end of the day, you have to, like a good judge, and you're in the legal profession, you have to weigh the facts. And if the facts point toward residential schools being a good thing at the time, because it provided kids with a leg up and a way of surviving into the 20th century and beyond, then maybe they're a good thing in some ways, or in many ways, or most ways, whatever. But just, we can't even talk about that without being in trouble. So I think the trans one is the worst. And the reason it's the worst is because you're telling kids who are depressed or vulnerable or isolated or friendless or all these things, they never go after some good-looking kid who's got wealthy parents and, you know, he or she is whatever doing, just got everything going. They go after the kids that, you know, they're vulnerable. And they were, you know, they said, oh, well, there's, you know, this club, by the way, you know, there's free pizza and there's pop and there's this, that. And they just groom. They literally at schools groom. And I've seen it. So if anyone ever says you can't use the word groomer, then you get in trouble. Well, get me in trouble, folks. Bring it on, because it's happening. And so they do this, and then they say to kids, well, your life's not perfect, as if any teenager's kid, any teen's life is perfect. Anyhow,
Right.
And maybe the problem is you're in the wrong body. Well, if you had said that to your regular father 10 years ago as a teacher, you said the teacher's saying, oh, I think your child, you know, it's parent-teacher night, maybe, you know, you should work harder at math and also, you know, change his body parts and be sterile for the rest of his life or her life. You know, they said that the father would probably get up and swing at the teacher.
Well,
So,
it would just
how
be
does
so
that happen?
ridiculous. I
It is
know.
so
I mean,
ridiculous.
like, it's unbelievable. Like, it doesn't even make any sense, right? So it's amazing to me actually how far the pendulum has gone. And I mean, people say that, and I don't really like that expression because I think it trivializes how actually severe and um impactful this is, what impact this is having on our society, right, and our children. Like, we're creating a society that is also going to become sterilized, because, you know, they're going to mutilate their bodies to the point where and take these puberty blockers so that they're not going to be able to likely have children again. But with this indigenous stuff, for instance, like what is do you see it, like, in addition to the authoritarianism, do you see it as being quite impactful? And I'm going to bring us back to where we started off with the word decolonization. I mean, I know that in BC, that a lot of the Lower Mainland in Vancouver has been ceded to the Aboriginals, Indigenous. Um, I know UNDRIP, you know, the Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, like all of this stuff. And, you know, in your article, even you talk about, you know, the UN Declaration of Children's Rights as well. I mean, all of these influences are falling on Canada. We've adopted a lot of them. We try to integrate their ideas and that philosophy within our laws, in our institutions. Almost all of our municipalities have been captured by the United Nations and the subsidiary organizations, and we're falling prey to the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, and stuff like that. And I do believe that there are globalist organizations that do not have Canadians' best interests in mind. I do believe that they are evil and that they have a nefarious agenda, which is depopulation, ultimately at their goal, which feeds really into, you know, when you destabilize a nation, a good way to do it is to pit people against people, you know, race against race, sexes against sexes, whatever it is, to create that instability. We have immigration coming in, but, you know, do you see this truth and reconciliation narrative, this false narrative, this virtue signaling narrative, as just being a distraction to what's actually happening in the background with, um, to try to take away private property rights from Canadians and ultimately land them in the hands of the government?
Well, absolutely. I love everything you say. I think that's the property rights thing, is that when you divide and conquer a population, you're there. What's the goal? Well, certainly people that are going to benefit from this. There's no ideology that doesn't, political ideology that doesn't serve some group of people and obviously injure others. So who's benefiting from this? Why? Maybe everybody that plays along. I don't know. Maybe people that are maybe this quiet cabal in some other country. Who knows? I don't have the brain capacity to figure out all the problems in the world. All I want to represent, although I think those who are in charge of the world are just an absolute embarrassment. I would say this. I would like you and your viewers, in the little time that you're getting to know me, is to know that I'm a teacher. And the job that I have to do in math is to teach math. And if 2 + 2 is 4, then that's what I teach. And there's a long tradition to suggest. If I'm being asked by my principal to talk about residential schools, on one occasion, I was teaching Calculus 12 at the time, and I do it, and I say something that is established, which is that those who died in residential schools, or while enrolled in residential schools, because many of them died while enrolled but back at the home reserve, did so from disease. There shouldn't be any fallout from that. So the whole thing is absolutely extraordinary to me, that we're allowing people to not only trust but to fear authority enough in Canada that we're accepting, like people in 1984, a complete perversion of what history was. And I think the next generation and all those after them have the same right that we have to see history as it was. They don't want us to erase anything. They don't want us to revise it. They just want to, like in a court of law, they want to listen to the facts and come to their own conclusions. That's kids. So I think
Well, and
please.
sorry. I mean, that is, to me, that is the true essence of celebrating the dignity of an individual, right? Like, that's the true respect, and the respect that we have for one another, that we can all have different opinions, different viewpoints, but have a unifying respect for one another, respecting the dignity of the humanity of each person. And for many years we've been able to get along kind of with that kind of a philosophy in mind. And I think that I just see that what's happened when we don't, I mean, there's clearly a right and wrong here, right? Like, there's clearly lies being told, and there's the left would call it misinformation, like the truth misinformation. um and so everything has been inverted. And so the problem I see really is being, we just have lost we don't agree on what the values are anymore of our society. Like, you can't, when you when one person believes that it's okay or impossible that you can change your biological sex to appear as something different than what you actually are, and you have other people that obviously know that that's incorrect. There's just no common ground here, right? There has to be an implosion.
Yeah, when you say they're taking away our common values in this divide and conquer game to
Yeah.
suit whoever, I believe the idea is to turn Canada over to Indigenous people and then completely instrumentalize Indigenous people to serve those who are manipulating in this way. They won't keep the land, they'll lose it. Anyhow, my point is,
No, I want to know more about that, because that's actually what I think is happening. I
but
think it's
Indigenous people are not leading this. Indigenous people are not lying about the past. Indigenous people are just being used by these white progressive liberals who think that it's a good idea for them, in some way they're going to advance in their career or financially, to lie to everybody and manipulate them and bring in a new cult. remove Christianity, remove any sense of rationality and reason from the school system and from society overall, and then people will be quite vulnerable. So there's so many things to go about. Both the land acknowledgements that we talked about earlier, is the idea that the land isn't ours anymore. We're going to take it away from you. Well, wherever it goes, that's tomorrow's problem. But why would you take my land away? Why would you take my neighbor's land away? What do you mean? Oh, historically. Well, okay. Why are you lying about the past to do it? Why are you saying the indigenous group that's in this land right now, they're supposed to get this, get my house, I don't know, get my property, or for me to pay rent forever to, probably wasn't here 200 years ago. Probably took it over from another band. They probably exterminated another band 200 years ago. I mean, my point is, they don't know the history. What history they do know is completely concocted. They don't know law, which is people do have fundamental rights. They have right to their property and so forth. So I think there's a great deal of threat. But again, I'm positioning myself as a teacher. I'm not going out and trying to take on the World Economic Forum or take on the Trudeau government and all these other forces that I think are quite dangerous. But I can be powerful and have an influence. And you've helped me by inviting me in your show, by telling people that the values, not just in our society that we all accepted and agreed with and celebrated, not only that's going, but so is the language. And that's what Orwell's message was. The way to get a dictatorship is to take away their language, to reduce language and control language. And so we're to the point right now. Last week, it was in the news that one of the justices on the Supreme Court said we shouldn't use the name woman. We should use the name person
with vagina.
Yeah. And then another thing came out 2 weeks ago where and all governments are sharing this, provincial governments and federal government, not to use the word Canada, not to use the word British Columbia, but you can say BC because people won't see British and they won't see Columbia. So in other words, the control of our language is unbelievable. And then all of a sudden they get someone like me and they go, well, we don't want this. We can't deal with this. And I'm saying, I'm a good teacher. I'm quiet. I don't say any of these things to kids. If I don't believe in kids transgendering, which I don't, because it's as common as being albino. Yeah, every once in a while there is a gender dysphoric child, and you got to deal with that. But it's a very rare thing. So I don't believe in so much of what's happening in schools.
Well, it used to be a rare thing until all the adults in the world.
Now that's right. Now you could have as many as 4 in a class, where it used to be 4 in a school in 100 years, if that. Probably 1 in 100 years in the school. So my thing is this: is what they're doing with our values and with our language is they're deforming us. They're making us not, as you said earlier, very prophetically, we don't really know where we are anymore. We're like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. Where are we, Toto? Like she doesn't, are we still in Kansas? Are we still in Canada? I don't think we are, because Canada that I know wouldn't do that to children. They wouldn't be bringing men who get aroused by dressing as women in front of little kids. They wouldn't bring them in to read to kindergarten kids. Like nobody with any mind thinks that this is a good idea, except for those who are profiting from it. So
100%. I mean, like, and I just want to like, and then we have this kind of like deception or this, it's like this inability to accept reality. Like we have a premier here in Alberta who has gone on the record on a True North interview that she did with Andrew Lawton a little while ago, actually, where she actually compared when the drag queen story hour was kind of like at its peak, and I know it's still going on, but she said that maybe drag queen story hours should maybe have the same sort of protection as church service does under the criminal code. Like this is yet we're and that just you tell people that, and I tell people this in our community. I mean, I'm a more conservative thinking person, I guess, is how you would describe me. And that to me just shakes me to my core, because I'm like, how can you even compare the two things? I mean, there's completely, it's ridiculous. And but this is where we're at, and it's almost like this cognitive dissonance that we're experiencing as people, and we're not putting these pieces together. I mean, you put the pieces together, you see that this agenda, this truth and reconciliation, land acknowledgement, all of this, not these lies are leading, they have an agenda in mind, and it's not about bringing people together. It's not life affirming. It's not dignifying human beings. It's actually to erode our very foundation of our capitalist society, our, in many cases, Christian, our society built on the framework of Judeo-Christian principles. That's where our laws are derived from. That's how our country was constituted. And instead, I do agree with you that their ultimate agenda is to use the indigenous, unwittingly in some cases, in most cases, I think, to hand ultimately do this land grab back to the globalists, really, whoever's in charge in Canada at the time,
Well,
whether
I
it's
don't, I don't, but the indigenous people are not benefiting. If you look at the
no,
reserves, I think they have the suicide rates, the drug problem, the abuse, the killing of indigenous women by indigenous men. You have you have so many really sad situations in a reserve. I would really be happy, and as myself, to work in whatever way I can to make life easier for anybody who's not as fortunate as I am or you are. Like that's what it's all about. I'm saying that these are smoke screens. This has nothing to do with, you're not helping them. You're just lying about the past, and you can manipulate everybody.
yeah,
And just one thing about the drag queen thing, which I find quite interesting, because I've read about this, and I'm sure most of your viewers have, but just in case. But there is something called autogynephilia, where there people it's people get off on on cross dressing. So the men that do this and dress up and are very sexual, and they go in front of kindergarten children and they read stories. They're not there to read stories. They're not interested in literature. They don't go back the next week and say, "Oh, here's some free books, kids." It's nothing to do with reading. It has nothing to do with literature. It has nothing to do with helping kids. But it does give them arousal.
right.
And you go, and they fired me for insisting on the truth
Oh yeah,
about
they
women.
fired. Yeah,
And
they
yet
fired. No, go
these
ahead.
people
Sorry.
literally, are they climaxing? I know that. To what extent are they sexually satisfied
Yeah,
in being in front of these children who have no choice, including the parents? The parents don't, in many cases, don't even know, because they do this at schools, not just in local libraries. They do it at schools, but they don't tell the parents most of the time, or they're very hush
yeah,
hush about it, because it's so. But all it is Hitler did it as well. He had his brown shirts, Mussolini his black shirts. They go for the children, and we're allowing it to happen. But I'm not. And if you can
you're
remember
not.
anything about me, I'm yeah, I know you're not, and I think
Yeah,
the two of us are going to make a difference, because and nobody wants to argue with us, but one day they're going to have to, and that's in my legal case right now. The union's not with me ideologically, and everybody else hates me and thinks that you can only say this and that about all these things. You can't say boys and girls, for example, etc. Okay, they're only boys and girls. Male and female, even plants. Everything is male and female. It's a binary world. So all life forms. So if you don't agree with that, show me the evidence contrary to that. But they don't do that. These
no,
cultists, these very frightening neo-communist equity pretenders, in many case, the highest paid people in our society are pushing equity. Oh yeah, sure. I bet you're going to give up your salary. And but what they're doing is they run the first. It's the moment they have to get into an argument, they have to actually be faced with somebody who's going, well, no, you're wrong. No, you're just wrong. You're wrong about race. If we're so racist, why are black players dominating major sports? What do you mean? Where's the evidence? Just show me the evidence. But they
yeah,
don't. They just call you names and then they run. So they're trying to do that with me. They're trying to bribe me or threatening for all these years. And I'm just going to them the same thing. I'm just going to say, I'm a teacher. The only thing I say to my students is the truth, as I
Yeah.
understand it, and as the consensus. If people
Well,
think the
the
world is
cons-
round, then I'm going to say the world's round. Not because I
yeah,
have tested it myself, although I can see that it is round, but I'm going to do what science and the brightest minds have told us to be true.
yeah,
And to do anything other than that is wrong. But nobody ever argues with me. Nobody comes up to me and says, "Oh, you've got white fragility." Because if they did, I'd say, "Watch it, because you're
yeah,
insulting me. And if you want to be insulted back, go right ahead, because I'm going to say things about you and your people and see how much you like that. Why don't you just come up to me and say, 'Jim, how are you doing?' And be nice to me, because that's how I live my life. I'm
yeah,
very charitable. I'm always nice to people. I don't go anywhere without trying to do good, hold doors open for people, put smile on my faces, help people in any way I can. That's how I am. So it's so unchristian. The woke program is so unchristian.
yeah. Oh, 100%. Well, it's because it's the antithesis, right? Satan hates God, and so, this is how it's playing out. But we've been chatting for just over,
I'm
90
sorry.
minutes here. No, I think it's wonderful. I mean, I could talk about these issues for a very long time, and I'm really just so thrilled that I have gotten to know you. And I hope that I do think we should probably end it, because people probably have stuff that they need to do tonight and whatnot. But I do want to. I hope we can keep in touch. I would like, getting back to your point about doing research, if you would please send me your some website links, and I'll put them when I upload this into Rumble. And if YouTube doesn't censor this, I'll put it onto YouTube as well. And it'll be on my website. But I would like to have the links to the information you think would be helpful for people, because you're right. People just, and the easier we can make it, the better, right? So we can just, so they don't have to do their own sleuthing around the internet. But will you please keep me informed with how your grievance goes? I want to be hopeful for you, and pray that true justice is done for you, and that more logical and ideas are going to prevail over these lies. But what you are doing is really important, and we need more people like you to be courageous, and damn the consequences. And I wish the very best for you and your family. And I just want you to know that when one door closes, another one opens, and we don't know really what beautiful things God has in store for us. But I know it's better. What He has in store for us is better than what's going on right now. Yeah. How can people find you? Can people follow you on social media, or do you have a
Yeah,
website?
I'm on Twitter right there. So thank you for
Okay.
um,
Okay.
yeah,
And will you
and
continue to
direct,
write
direct.
for the Frontier Center?
Oh yeah, various places, and I answer direct messages to me. And I'm
Okay,
just wanting
wonderful.
to thank you, Katherine, for giving me this
Well,
opportunity.
thank you for sharing your story, and you're very insightful. And thank you for confirming some of the things that I have been circulating in my head as well, trying to piece together all these put the puzzle together. And so I'm grateful for you coming on. And again, condolences about the passing of your father. And please, let's keep in touch.
Well, I would love that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and have a good night.
You too. God bless.
Good, God bless.